I'm going to talk a little bit about my deliverable today, but I came at this presentation actually came out of just sort of reflections over the past few weeks since the Trump administration has taken power and certain executive orders that are being instituted in the United States right now, including things doing away with like diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also certain kinds of policies that are trying to be implemented that, for example, prevent trans persons from using their the identified gender on their passports or on legal documents. And I've just been thinking a lot about kind of social justice issues. And as I was sort of at the same time thinking about my presentation for this workshop and the deliverable, which remains this essay for an edited volume on epistemic injustice and religion. And I'll talk a little bit more about epistemic injustice in a few minutes. My contribution there is dealing sort of with intellectual theodicy and theodicy approaches, and the ways in which the use of some of the post-traumatic growth ideas is being applied actually in ways that I think serve to or run the risk of doing more harm than good. So that still sort of remains the project. But as I was getting into it and really thinking a lot about this, I just started thinking more about like, where is the justice in the sort of post-traumatic growth paradigm? Where is this, where is the community? Where is society? Where are these issues? And thinking about forms of trauma that don't kind of neatly match what a lot of the kinds of cases that you see in the post-traumatic growth literature. Now, none of this is supposed to be totalizing. There's always exceptions to, every claim here, and there is a lot of work, I think, right now, especially that's starting to kind of go in the directions that I think I would like to see. But what I wanted to do was just to reflect a little bit on some of my concerns about the research paradigm as it sort of has kind of come up in the last 30 years and where it might go in the future based on sort of what we've done over the last year in this course. So, okay, the camera is kind of covering my slide. But one criticism that you do find about the post-traumatic growth research literature is that even 30 years after its inception, it's still kind of relying largely on the self-reports of individual persons, kind of the subjective self-reports of growth as experienced by individuals. We saw that with Jaya Wickreen Blackie's critiques of some of the methodologies in the PTG literature. They've also criticized that it tends to be backward-looking and retrospective analyses of sort of concrete, discrete events with a very clear before and after, such that you can speak of post-traumatic growth in a very kind of clear-cut sense. There are, again, there are exceptions, right? There is some work that's trying to be more prospective. But still there's a lot of kind of retrospective analyses using largely unidirectional scales that might prime subjects or bias them in favor of growth. So a lot of the versions of the PTGI have 0 being like no growth, no experience growth, to 5 being like a lot of experience growth, but there's no kind of option to say like it went the other direction or it went in a very negative direction. And so a lot of the research that you get kind of looks like this. So I'm going to come back to that in a second. But I did kind of ask myself, okay, where is the notion of justice in the PTG paradigm? Like, where do we find discussions of justice at all in this kind of literature? And it does seem, though, in talking with Farhud this morning, I realized that I do think it's a little bit more complicated than this. But, there are some approaches to trauma on which what trauma does is it shatters certain fundamental assumptions about the world, including sometimes these beliefs about a just world, the idea that those who perpetrate violence will sort of get their comeuppance, and that the world is ultimately a good and just place. So sometimes you see this kind of idea sneaking into discussions of post-traumatic growth, though I get the sense that also sometimes it stands in contrast to that, depending on the clinical approaches to post-traumatic growth. There's also a recent article by Harvey and Blackie that I thought was really interesting, which said that they did a number of studies that indicated sort of that self-reports of post-traumatic growth might reflect post-traumatic growth, but they might also reflect a coping mechanism of restoring belief in a just world. And that's not identified with sort of the characteristics taken to be symptomatic of post-traumatic growth. So there's this kind of competing explanation. This might be one thing that explains why people report growth, but here's this other possibility. I thought that was interesting. But there's not a lot of discussions of kind of, justice in a sort of, robust philosophical sense. And, maybe we shouldn't expect that. But, and then I thought, well, okay, so a lot of this is heavily individualistic. Where's the social aspect? And certainly, as the last point says, social support gets play in the literature. One of the things that's asked about or that's looked at is what kinds of social support structures does a person have? But it appears to me, at least from what I could see, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, that structural social stressors get less attention in terms of what kinds of social support someone might have or lack thereof, right? I've been looking a lot at the Taku Tedeschi and Calhoun workbook on post-traumatic growth. It's a little bit more recent than some of the earlier work. And they do talk about the role of empowerment in facilitating post-traumatic growth. But the flip side of empowerment and the kind of experience of lack of power and so on, when it comes to the central role that structural power plays in trauma of marginalized and oppressed populations, I haven't seen much treatment of that. And when they do kind of talk about post-traumatic growth of families or siblings or more than one person at a time or groups, it tends to focus on mass singular events that were experienced by the same people, and then do they grow the same amount or not, and what explains differences and stuff. But not so much ongoing structural issues that represent a sort of either inherited or ongoing trauma for communities. So it's not that there's no social aspect in the research, but the sort of structural systemic aspects of trauma, to my mind, from what I've seen, go often kind of unremarked on. Now, this is going to be, as the Germans say, ein bisschen überspitzt. So this is not to say that these epistemic harms are necessarily perpetrated by the research paradigm or whatever. But it is something that's worth thinking about. So when I say epistemic harms, I'm thinking about this notion of epistemic injustice. And some of you will be familiar with this, some of you won't. The label epistemic injustice comes from Miranda Fricker in her widely read 2007 book, Epistemic Injustice. But basically, epistemic injustices are injustices that harm persons in their capacity as knowers or bearers of knowledge. And there's lots of different kinds and manifestations of epistemic injustice that have been discussed in the philosophical literature since Fricker's book. And Fricker's actually picking up on what a lot of feminist and post-colonial thinkers have been talking about for a long time in the non-analytic tradition. She just kind of brought it into the analytic tradition. But Fricker herself, she distinguishes between two kinds of epistemic injustices: testimonial injustices, in which a person's credibility is undermined due to a kind of prejudice, neglect, bias, whatever. So a person's credibility or ability to give their testimony, as it were, to be a credible testifier, is undermined. So when somebody who is credible to talk about their own experience is sort of treated as not credible. Hermeneutical injustices, on the other hand, refer to sort of gaps in conceptual resources. So entire groups, Fricker uses the example of like sexual harassment and the origin of the sort of term sexual harassment in like the 70s and 80s, but that women, it's not like sexual harassment was invented in the 80s, right? But it was the time period in which women kind of came together and were able to collectively give a name to this thing that they had sort of commonly experienced. And so hermeneutical injustices refer to sort of motivated lacks in conceptual resources that make it even more difficult to acquire knowledge on a subject, for example. And one of the worries, I hope this is not too small or white, but one of the worries is that there may be some epistemic harms that the PTG paradigm, as it's kind of traditionally been exercised, is contributing to. So first, there's certain external meaning frameworks on, what is sometimes very bad and deep suffering, or what I call really bad shit in my scientific terms, that themselves, of course, come from a particular perspective, right? And the question is, what is going to count as flourishing? What is going to count as meaning? And so these kind of meaning frameworks that have been imposed on certain experiences might lead us to conclude that growth, for example, is not present, or we don't see growth when it actually is there, or that we misdiagnose growth when perhaps it's not there. There's a potential to threaten to normalize traumatic suffering as a sort of positive, transformative opportunity. And so suffering gets, even though the lip service will be paid to, like, yes, we heard from Tedeschi himself. He said, no one's going to say this experience was not bad. Like, we assume the experience was bad. But this kind of narrative recasting in the growth paradigm might normalize that kind of suffering as part of this sort of very natural story in a way that might do an injustice to an individual's or a group's experience. In its most extreme cases, in certain clinical settings, it can implicitly require survivors to demonstrate growth to be heard. So which survivors or which trauma victims do we care about? Well, we care about those who are demonstrating growth. These are the ones we're interested in. So there's worries about testimonial injustices, privileging of particular narratives over others. I'll talk about that in a second. And potentially even, these are all related, but potentially even sort of creating hierarchies of credible pain or credible suffering. And this, it might be that this is a result. It might be that this is sort of implicitly causing the research to be as it is. I'll get to it in a second. In any case, again, these are just sort of potential risks, I think, that the emphasis on growth is sort of, runs the risk of perpetrating. Now, there's a really recent special issue of American Psychologist, edited by Adler and Schwabe, and basically it contains a bunch of articles that are roughly speaking saying, look, it's not that we need to reject the kind of PTG paradigm altogether, but we do need to kind of move beyond move beyond trauma, and move beyond growth if we really want to do justice to post-traumatic growth, which of course sounds a little bit paradoxical, but I think that's with intent. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about this, because I think this is a really interesting idea given what we've talked about over the last year. So how can we move past the idea of the post in post-traumatic growth? Well, one thing is to note that there's not always a neat and tidy before and after when it comes to trauma. Trauma is not always episodic, and especially in cases of like systemic oppression, intergenerational trauma, trauma perpetrated by the means of problematic social structures, but also when you think about people who, where Farha was talking about daily stressors yesterday, but like where the accumulation of a particular kind of daily stressor, something like a microaggression, for example, over time can be enough to sort of overwhelm somebody in a certain kind of way. It's also unclear in a lot of cases, so Judith Herman talks about this with survivors of sexual violence, that there may never be an after, really. There's an after the event, but the trauma continues. And the trauma continues especially because it's perpetrated, survivors of sexual assault are often not believed, not heard, victims are blamed. They see it happening again and again and again. They see serial perpetrators being put into positions of power, and so on. And so the trauma is not ever really over and done with, such that we can talk about, okay, now have you grown, right? And so, this kind of overly simplistic episodic treatment is certainly something that might want to be avoided. One suggestion from this volume is to move from this kind of discrete fulcrum metaphor of like everything hinges on this one kind of episode and there's a before and after, to a more dynamic, perhaps even like a spatial understanding of adversity and response. I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like, but I think it's an interesting suggestion. I'm not going to spend much time here. I got a lot of stuff on the slide, but mostly I've been a little bit confused myself going through the literature about what constitutes trauma and what definition of trauma people are working with. Sometimes groups are a little more or less explicit, but sometimes post-traumatic growth really just refers to growth coming from struggle or adversity, but not necessarily trauma. And I mean, certainly we don't want to be defining trauma by just talking about like whatever it is that, whatever kinds of adversity leads ultimately to growth. Like that would be really bad for a research paradigm to beg the question that way, right? So, I always kind of wanted to hear a little bit more about what exactly is meant by trauma in these contexts, or whether we're talking about a different kind of phenomenon. So in that sense, like there's this threat that the literature is sort of overstretching the term trauma. On the other hand, things like the DSM-5, for example, certainly don't cover all the cases that we want to call trauma. So personally, I think criterion A of the DSM-5 just sucks. It says the person, like this is the required criterion for PTSD. The person was exposed to death, threat, injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence in the following way: direct exposure, witnessing trauma, learning that the trauma happened to a close relative or friend, indirect exposure to adverse details of the trauma. But that doesn't cover nearly the vast number of cases that I think we are actually pre-theoretically inclined to call trauma, and it certainly doesn't cover things like systemic injustices and the systemic trauma experienced by oppressed and marginalized groups. So one suggestion is to kind of adapt a version of Herman's approach as trauma just being events or experiences that end up overwhelming the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning, or overcome the ordinary adaptations to life, I think she talks about. I think actually Tedeschi and Calhoun in some places, like in a little footnote, they say something kind of similar to this. But it never really gets like spelled out. In any case, I think it jives with the current research paradigm. So what makes traumatic events and experiences extraordinary is not that they're rare, but rather that they're kind of overwhelming in a certain kind of way. And it can include not only events, but also like sustained experience of systemic injustice and oppression, accumulation of smaller stressors, secondhand vicarious trauma, and the like. And then growth. My biggest problem is with the term growth. We had this yesterday in the final talk, right? But the term growth often displays implicit or unreflective, and it has to be said, not seldomly kind of white cis heteronormative, evaluative and normative features that might end up reifying oppressive definitions of what it means to grow or develop. So I think one of the examples given is like if you're a Native kid forced to go to a reform school, what's going to count as sort of you may be able to adapt in order to function really in ways that allow you to contribute to that kind of society. But it's a kind of society that's continually sort of marginalizing and oppressing you. Is that growth? Is that, what do we want to say about those kinds of things? And while we're at it, I would say, could we get over gratitude too? But that's just a personal thing. But I do think there is something deeply wrong about even suggesting to somebody who's undergone a very serious trauma, undergone horrendous suffering, that there's got to be something that they're grateful for in the suffering. I think that kind of implicit insistence is highly problematic. Judith Herman has a new book out about what victims, she's talking about victims of sexual violence. But what she finds, I think, might be generalizable. Well, I think there's, we could talk about that a little bit more. But one thing that is important to think about on the social level is the importance of acknowledgement, accountability, and reparative action on the community level. So growth can be represented by an individual. An individual can undergo it, sure, but often what matters to individuals is that they see some sort of reparative action on the community level. It'd be really interesting to think about how these two aspects are related, how recovery and or growth are related to seeing actual change or being able to affect change on a community level. All right, just the last slide, what we can do. This is one area where I think we can have increased engagement between philosophy and psychology is in the area of epistemic injustice, silencing similar structural inhibiting factors. There is some dialogue going on here between philosophers and psychologists on these kinds of issues, things like testimonial silencing, smothering, things like that. It'd be interesting to see how that could come in conversation with research on personality and post-traumatic growth. I think more research needs to be done on what personality change or growth looks like on alternative models of what it is to flourish or what it is to grow. In clinical settings, this is where the moral kidnapping comes in that my students are also worried about, right? This idea of like being morally hijacked by certain norms. This worry about like, let's not hijack survivors by norming growth in a certain way as best we can. And perhaps bringing in something from ethics. Flourishing and stuff is already part of ethics, right? It's eudaimonistic ethics, virtue ethics, things like that. But bringing in some elements from other areas of normative theory with the idea that transformative growth is not necessarily something one ought to have, or acts of growth, for example, are what we call supererogatory. That is good to do or have, but not bad not to do or have. And so, you know, in a theological sense, to think of those who do go out and perform community actions, who do try to change society in light of their own experiences, that those actions, like we shouldn't put the burden on survivors to do that, but that those actions are wholly supererogatory. And that if we're going to bring gratitude in, we should be grateful for that kind of action. I think that's it. That was just a lot of thoughts, but it's just me trying to wrap my head around thinking about post-traumatic growth on a more kind of social level and what role it might play. So I'm more than happy to have pushback, corrections, further ideas, but thanks for putting up with me for a while.
Definitely a welcome, fresh, and different approach, and provocative, I think, or inspiring. I wouldn't say provocative, inspiring.
Provocative's okay too. I don't mind. I like to poke. Socratic gadflies are right by me.
Okay, we have time for maybe 3 questions. Yes.
I was wondering whether, like, people from oppressed communities, whether they have already formulated some kind of criticism to this, let's call it the standard approach to PTG.
Yeah, so this this special issue of American Psychologist edited by Adler and Schwabe, there's a number of articles that are doing just that. They're pushing the paradigm in a certain in a way.
I mean, what aspects of the classical concept are they criticizing?
Various aspects. So some of it is in terms of the kinds of characteristics of what it means to grow, or frameworks for flourishing and meaning making. And thinking about alternative forms. Some of it is, so it's not all negative criticism, but some of it is saying, like, look, in focusing on the kinds of things that the research paradigm has tended to focus on, it's actually overlooked really interesting mechanisms for growth, which is how, for example, oppressed and marginalized communities also bring with them a shared and collective knowledge passed down over generations about how to grapple with marginalization and oppression. Coping mechanisms, but also means of, like, how do you flourish when you live in this kind of society? So there are epistemic resources that are untapped, given the way the paradigm has kind of retained its focus on these things that I talked about. But that's only a few. So there's a number of different ways. I think some of it is also the retrospective versus prospective thing, wanting more longitudinal studies, but also they're very skeptical about the possibility of predicting growth. At least the editors of this volume were very skeptical about predicting growth, and saying that basically, like, maybe we should give up on trying to predict who's going to grow and who's not, and that might be okay for the paradigm. So there's a lot of different ways that they're pushing back, and I think they're all very interesting. Yeah.
Marcus?
Well, yeah. I once saw a documentary about a Jewish woman who suffered in maybe even a concentration camp, I guess it was. And
can you speak just a little louder?
Yeah. And she was concerned with justice for all her life, and she couldn't find inner peace. And maybe you know this person. I forgot her name. I don't know when the documentary was. So the final story was, she said that she could only find inner peace once she started forgiving the oppressors, and the story was really touching.
So Eva Moses Kor, what's her name?
Yes.
Yeah, she was
Okay.
there as a little girl in Auschwitz with her sibling, like
Okay.
a twin
Yeah,
sister.
I need to,
Yeah.
to write the name
Yeah.
down to see it again. I'm a great fan of justice, and I struggle myself to get justice here or there because, sometimes so little trauma. Yeah, I do not want to talk about great, maybe it was, is, well, anyway. But this really shattered my worldview, kind of. So I wonder, because we want to get in a peace, we use different kind of coping mechanisms to get there. You talked about justice, you talked about empowerment, and yeah, how do you think about this?
Yeah.
So there is justice, and maybe forgiving could be the other end of it. So kind of a bipolar, maybe not a dynamic between the two, but it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it would be really interesting to connect up, I think, research in post-traumatic growth with issues in the restorative justice movement. And Judith Herman's new book tries to kind of thread that needle a little bit. I mean, she's not interested in the post-traumatic growth paradigm. She's talking more about recovery. But she talks about recovery and repair. And one of the things with forgiveness, so the restorative justice movement is interesting because in some of it, you have victims actively confronting their perpetrators, right? And forgiveness plays a major role in their kind of healing process. Usually, I think it's paired with, forgiveness plus an emphasis on change, right? Something in society has to change, right? Forgiveness of the individual, but activism for change in the structures. I do get worried about the ways in which forgiveness itself gets normed in ways that can harm people. I held a conference once, and it was a conference on something else, but one of the participants is very active in philosophy prison programs and stuff, and does a lot of really, really good work, and is very kind of heavily into the restorative justice movement, and started saying, well, look, it's so amazing when you can see forgiveness happening and stuff. And then somebody sitting at the table says, got very upset and said, you can't tell me that I need to forgive my rapist. I cannot, that's not something that I'm okay with, and I will never be okay with that, and it should be okay that I'm not okay with that, right? And so you're right, like it's very interesting to see that this, varies from individual to individual. What role can forgiveness play? What role ought forgiveness play? There's also on the social level, so my husband has done some work on, he's a historian, but doing work on like truth and reconciliation committees. So it seems to have worked fairly well in South Africa, the way that they set it up, where victims are testifying in front of perpetrators and actively confronting them. But the implementation of the South African-style truth and reconciliation committees in other places has not worked so well. And so there seems to be certain things that might be culturally contingent about things like reconciliation as a form of cultural accountability or social accountability. And all that is to say is, yeah, shit's complicated, right? But it'd be really interesting, I think, to see more happening from this kind of psychological paradigm of post-traumatic growth, more dialogue with those kinds of actors and that kind of research as well. So yeah, thanks.
Time for one more question.
Do you have one?
No, I only want to make one short remarks. I think the point you are struggling with is the tension between justice and mercy or compassion. But I heard your topic in the direction of what are the epistemic biases in my personal research and in my personality. And what is a normative order in the society I'm living in, or because society defines what is meant by growth and healthy and stable orders, and it was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think I admit the epistemic injustice stuff is a little bit forced in there because that's going to be part of the deliverable, which is going in the direction of theodicy and what we talked about yesterday and so on. But I think it's an important aspect for any research paradigm to kind of think about, you know, who's included, who's excluded, by virtue of the way we're setting up our categories, and where do those categories come from, what are those categories like, who gets a seat at the table in thinking about what those categories are supposed to be doing, and so on. And that's where I think the role of epistemic injustice can be helpful in sort of critically interrogating some of the things that we take for granted within a research paradigm. Farhud, you had a question though?
Yeah, I have a question. So I was wondering, because you mentioned ethics, so what theories and what parts of ethics do you find highly relevant to the context of post-traumatic growth?
Yeah, so, you know, the thing is it strikes me that where there's been a connect up with ethics thus far, and this is also heavily present in like what Templeton funds and what kinds of things they're interested in throwing money at, which is virtue theory. And sort of eudaemonist approaches to the good life, right? And those are all very important and interesting topics. Things like virtues, what virtues help us flourish, things like intellectual humility, openness, you know, and so on. What I haven't seen as much money thrown at is, so in sort of overarching views, there's virtue ethics, and then there's sort of like normative ethics concerned more with like what we ought to do, actions, more action-based as opposed to character-based, right? And then you have sort of, you know, deontological views and consequentialist views and that. And then you also have things like social ethics, and which often tends to combine these other kinds of approaches. It's not that these are all kind of exclusive approaches, because you can't kind of get at what makes for a flourishing human being without thinking about like what a flourishing human being would do. And then the answer to the question of what you ought to do is usually just like, well, what would the virtuous person do? And that gets you your sort of theory of right action. My suggestion is to think of the acts of individuals and groups to take reparative action or to try to change the systems that have oppressed and marginalized or just not listened to them. To see those acts, you could do it from a virtue theoretic standpoint, but to see those acts as things that are sort of like acts of grace. They may function to help them grow, but they're not for that purpose, and neither should there be any sort of implicit expectation that one ought to do these kinds of things, but rather they are kind of going above and beyond what is morally demanded of them. So I think a lot of times there's a demand placed on victims to educate the public, right? So like, you're a member of a marginalized group, you tell me what it's like. Tell me what I need to know, right? And so they feel an extra duty to educate, but also a duty to like, well, you know what's going to be best for you, so you make it better, right? And those kinds of norms, I think, are problematic. So that's kind of where I was going with the supererogatory stuff, but yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you guys, I appreciate it.